Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The sun had barely risen when the church bells chimed their first call for morning prayers. The sleepy town of Antioch stirred to life and rhythm with the sound, and as always, the name on everyone's lips was Pastor Peter. Clad in his spotless white agbada, trimmed with gold thread, he moved through the church compound with calm authority. People bowed slightly as he passed, ushers, choir members, even elders. He greeted them with that measured voice of his, laced with grace and just the right dose of charm. Children waved shyly. Traders near the gate paused their setup just to catch a glimpse of him. To the world, he was a man without blemish, anointed, deeply spiritual, and unwavering in discipline. In church, he preached like thunder. Every verse sounded new when he read it, every prayer left people in tears. If Pastor Peter said amen, people echoed it as though their lives depended on it. At home, his wife Chiz played the perfect partner, tall, firm-eyed, and elegant. She didn't speak often in public, but her silence only seemed to elevate her. She was the kind of woman people didn't pity when they admired her husband. They envied her. It was during those early days of glory that something subtle began to change. It wasn't loud. It didn't shake the ground. But the people who paid close attention noticed it in moments. The new way Pastor Peter lingered near some of the younger women after service, his hands holding theirs a bit longer than necessary during prayer. A few whispers floated around like wind, nothing strong enough to stir concern, just light enough to be laughed off. Chiz, who managed the women's ministry, was used to stories. She'd heard many things wives in church circles dealt with. But her husband? Not Peter. He was different. He was chosen. She believed in the calling on his life more than she believed in some of the words people loosely tossed around. Still, her instincts weren't dead. She started noticing how certain women looked at him, quick, nervous glances, like someone hiding a secret. Sometimes, she caught him looking back at them. But he always smiled and said, "They see me as their shepherd." And she would nod. That made sense. She had married a shepherd. But behind the church walls and outside the house they had built together, a slow erosion had begun. Pastor Peter, the same man who rebuked sin from the pulpit with fire, had started to dabble in it like a game he believed he was above losing. It wasn't that he didn't feel guilt, he did. But guilt, to him, was now something to be managed, not avoided. A quick midnight prayer. A longer fast. He told himself these things kept him balanced. And when Chiz noticed that his late-night calls became more frequent, or that he changed his phone password, he would sigh, disappointed that she didn't trust him. "You know the devil wants to attack men like me," he said one night, his voice low and trembling with emotion. She had reached to comfort him, ashamed for doubting. That night, she knelt beside the bed and prayed aloud for strength, for both of them. She never imagined that her prayer might not be enough. It began with Sister Rose. She was one of the newer converts, early 20s, always in the front row during Sunday services, and quick to offer her time for anything the church needed. People admired her zeal. Pastor Peter noticed her commitment too. He began to call on her more often, first to lead prayers, then to assist with events, then for one-on-one spiritual mentoring. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? He was the man of God, and she, just another eager soul in need of guidance. But late one Thursday evening, Chiz walked into the church office unannounced. She had come to drop off some church documents. The door was slightly open, and what she saw would remain etched in her mind forever. Pastor Peter, leaning in too close to Rose, their laughter too intimate, the air between them too thick to deny. They didn't notice her. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked out, the file still in her hand, her heart pounding so loud she couldn't hear her own footsteps. The days that followed were silent between them. Pastor Peter acted normal, too normal. He still left early for church meetings, still prayed before bed, still laid hands on the sick during services. But Chiz could no longer look at him the same. She didn't confront him immediately. She watched, and the more she watched, the more she saw. Different faces, different women, late-night messages, deleted call logs. She knew she wasn't imagining it. The man she had stood beside all these years was slipping away, not from temptation, but from something darker, entitlement. He began to speak to her with less patience. He was easily irritated, quick to correct, and slower to show affection. On one occasion, during a heated exchange, he told her plainly, "You're not the only woman who understands me, Chiz." That sentence hung in the air like smoke. She said nothing. She just sat there, holding onto the edge of the sofa, blinking back tears she refused to let fall. That night, she lay in bed awake while he snored beside her. But this was not a pastor. It wasn't long before the whispers grew teeth. Women in the choir began to withdraw. A deacon's wife refused to let her daughter attend a youth camp anymore. Something was rotting at the heart of the ministry. One morning after service, an anonymous letter was slipped under the church office door. It was detailed. Names, dates, places. It accused Pastor Peter of repeated sexual misconduct with multiple women in the church. When he read it, he didn't flinch. He called a private meeting with the board and insisted it was a coordinated attack from the devil, jealous people who couldn't bear his growth. Chiz was called in too, just to show unity. She stood beside him during that meeting, nodded when he spoke, smiled when necessary. But when they got home, she packed a small suitcase, calmly folded her clothes into it, and told him she was leaving. "I can't be part of this," she said. And you know why. He didn't try to stop her. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, not in guilt, but in calculation. She walked out without looking back, and for the first time since they met, there was no prayer between them, just silence. The wedding was quiet. No flamboyant celebration, no loud music, no flood of guests. Just a small gathering in the pastor's lounge and a few selected elders who still believed in restoration. They said things like, "Let us not judge. God restores those he calls, and every man of God goes through trials." Bless sat beside Pastor Peter, dressed in a modest lace gown, her eyes lowered through most of the ceremony. She barely spoke except to say, "I do." At 27, she wasn't naive, but she believed in second chances. She believed in redemption. People talked, of course. Some said she was a fool. Others said she was brave. Either way, she carried herself with a kind of quiet grace that disarmed even her loudest critics. Her smile was gentle, her tone soft, and she moved like someone who had trained herself not to offend. When she walked through the church corridors as the new mummy pastor, many women watched her with a strange mix of pity and curiosity. She didn't seem like someone who would survive in Peter's world, but she stayed. The house felt too big in the early months. It had been decorated long before the wedding, with Chiz's touch still lingering in the curtains, the color of the tiles, the framed scriptures on the hallway walls. Blessed never asked about Chiz, and Peter never mentioned her. Their routine was simple: morning prayers, devotion, breakfast, church meetings. Blessed followed, watched, and learned. Her role as the pastor's wife was clear: smile when spoken to, nod when necessary, and don't ask too many questions. She longed for children, and they began trying early. Every missed period brought hope. Every visit to the hospital brought fresh disappointment. After 3 months of trying, Peter suggested they go for tests. Blessed agreed. Her results came back fine. Peter never told her the outcome of his own. He simply shrugged and said, "These things take time." She nodded. She was raised to respect her husband, and she had learned that silence sometimes was safer than truth. Still, every time a baby cried in church, something inside her stirred. She would close her eyes and pray that her womb would one day sing too. It was around this time she started noticing the late returns. Some nights, Peter claimed he was counseling someone. Other times, he said he was praying with a family in crisis. Blessed always waited up, seated on the couch with her Bible open on her lap, though her eyes rarely moved past the same page. He would return smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, his shirt slightly creased, his phone face down on the table. She never asked questions. Instead, she would take the shirt, iron it again for the next day, and serve him warm food. He'd eat in silence, barely glancing at her, then head to the bedroom. The house grew quieter with each passing week. The once calm silence became something heavy, like air thick with secrets. She began fasting more, rising before dawn to cry into her pillow, begging God to restore joy to her home. But there was a feeling she couldn't shake, a weight on her chest, as if something dark was crawling just beneath the surface of her peace, just waiting to be unleashed. The first time Blossom arrived at the parsonage, she ran into Blessed's arms like a child coming home after a long journey. She had just turned 17 and had completed her secondary school exams in Benin. The plan was simple: stay for a few months in Lagos with her sister while waiting for admission into the university. Blessed was overjoyed to have family close. She decorated the guest room with new bed sheets, set up a reading table, and even made Blossom's favorite stew the evening she arrived. Blossom brought a new kind of energy into the house, a breath of youth and ease that Blessed hadn't realized she'd missed. She was bubbly, full of questions, always laughing and eager to help. In the mornings, she followed her sister around the house, cleaning and learning how to prepare breakfast the way Peter liked it. She was respectful too, calling Peter sir or uncle, always dropping her eyes when he walked in, and often excusing herself when he and Blessed were speaking. Everything seemed fine, innocent, safe. But slowly, the dynamic began to shift. It started with the glances. Peter would look at Blossom a second too long when she passed. He'd lean against the kitchen doorway while she cooked, asking about her favorite songs or what she wanted to study in school. At first, it seemed like harmless curiosity. Even Blessed thought nothing of it. She believed her husband was simply showing kindness. Then came the lingering touches, a hand on her shoulder when she served his food, a palm brushing her lower back as she stepped aside to let him through the corridor. Blossom noticed. She wasn't naive. She had read enough and seen enough to understand when a man's attention turned from fatherly to something else. It confused her. Peter was her sister's husband, a man of God. She tried to avoid him, waking up earlier to finish chores, staying longer at the neighbor's to braid hair, or pretending to nap during the afternoons when Blessed went to church meetings. But avoidance only made his pursuit more calculated. One afternoon, the rain had started suddenly, and Blossom had rushed back from the gate, drenched and shivering. Blessed had gone to visit a church member, so the house was quiet. Peter met her at the door with a towel, his hands gentle but firm as he wrapped it around her shoulders. She muttered a thank you and tried to walk past him, but he held her back. That was the first time he kissed her, quick, silent, like a thief in the dark. She pulled away, eyes wide with shock, but he only smiled and said, "Don't be afraid. You're special." She ran into her room and locked the door, her heart pounding. That night, she couldn't eat. She couldn't even meet her sister's eyes. The next day, he acted like nothing had happened, cracking jokes over breakfast, asking about her favorite movies, even praying during family devotion. Blossom began to shrink into herself. The house that once felt warm now seemed to carry shadows in every corner. She didn't tell Blessed. She couldn't. How do you tell your sister that her husband is looking at you in ways no man should? How do you say it without tearing everything apart? So she stayed quiet. But silence is never safe for long. The boundaries fell slowly, almost invisibly, like dust settling on a windowsill until the light no longer shone the same way. What started with that stolen kiss became a pattern, quiet, calculated, and terrifying. Peter never touched her when Blessed was home. He waited for the house to fall into its evening hush, for blessed soft snoring to confirm she was asleep. Then he'd knock lightly on Blossom's door, never saying a word. The first few times, she didn't open. She sat on her bed, knees pulled to her chest, shaking and crying silently, hoping he'd go away. But one night, when she thought she couldn't carry the weight of fear and confusion anymore, she opened the door. He didn't speak. He didn't rush. He sat beside her, whispering about how beautiful she was, how special, how God brings people into our lives for a reason. His voice was so calm, so rehearsed, it felt like a sermon. When he finally kissed her again, she didn't resist. Not because she wanted it, but because her will had started to erode, and his confidence had already written the outcome. Afterward, he told her not to worry. No one will ever know, and if they do, they won't believe it. Days turned into weeks, and Blossom began to live inside herself. The vibrant girl who once danced while sweeping the floor now moved like a shadow. She barely laughed. She barely spoke. She avoided mirrors. Guilt chewed at her insides, but shame kept her silent. How could she explain what was happening? That she never said yes, but somehow never screamed no. Peter was always careful. During the day, he wore his role like a polished garment, leading prayers, laying hands, preaching with a fire that made people cry. But at night, he shed that image like skin. And in those hours, Blossom became a secret he fed on. Blessed noticed the changes. She asked if Blossom was okay, and Blossom always nodded, even as her voice trembled. Just tired, she'd say. Or, I miss home a little. Blessed would pull her into a hug, unaware of the storm unraveling inches behind her back. The walls of their house became thick with silence, each person hiding something: Peter, his sin; Blossom, her trauma; Blessed, her suspicion. Then the nausea began. It came in waves, unrelenting and unpredictable. Blossom would excuse herself from breakfast, sometimes running to the bathroom before anyone could stop her. Bless took her to the clinic one humid afternoon, gently holding her hand as they waited for the test results. Neither of them spoke much. When the nurse returned, her face held no surprise, just the professionalism of someone who had seen this too many times. She's about 8 weeks pregnant, she said, placing the results on the table. Bless turned to her sister slowly. Blossom's eyes welled with tears, her lips trembling. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then, in a voice so low it was nearly a whisper, she said, It's Peter." The silence that followed was unlike anything that had ever filled that room before. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of something breaking. Blessed stared at her sister, her mouth slightly open, as if the words couldn't reach her ears. And in that moment, the world, her world, began to shift beneath her feet. They didn't speak on the drive home. The sun had already begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. Blessed kept her eyes on the road, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Blossom sat beside her, hands folded tightly over her belly, her eyes glued to the floor of the car. The air between them was thick, too heavy for words, too full for breath. At home, Blessed didn't go to her room or the kitchen like she usually would. Instead, she went straight to the small prayer room at the end of the hallway, shut the door, and remained inside for over an hour. No weeping, no shouting, just silence. When she finally emerged, her face was unreadable. Blossom stood by the doorway, not sure if she should speak or run. Bless simply looked at her, the kind of look that stripped away every excuse, every explanation. Then she said softly, "Go and pack your things. You're going back home." Her voice didn't shake, but something in her eyes did, something so pained it looked like it might break her from the inside out. Blossom begged. Not because she didn't want to go, but because she was afraid. Afraid of what their parents would say. Afraid of the shame. Afraid of losing the only person who had protected her even without knowing it. "Please," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But Blessed didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She didn't even cry. "You're going home," she repeated, and this time it sounded final. That night she made jollof rice for dinner, just like any other evening. Peter came home late, as usual, humming a tune as he walked through the front door. He noticed the packed bag by the wall. "What's going on?" he asked casually, already loosening his tie. Blessed didn't answer. She simply handed him his food and watched him eat. Every bite he took made her stomach twist. He looked up once and asked, "Why is Blossom packing?" She met his eyes then and said, with a calmness that chilled him, "She's pregnant." His hand paused midair. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The silence swallowed everything else. The next morning, Blessed drove Blossom to their family house. It was a 4-hour journey, filled with long stretches of road and longer stretches of quiet. When they arrived, their mother opened the gate, surprised but smiling, until she saw the bags and the look on both their faces. Inside, as Blessed sat the family down and explained everything, the reaction was far from what she expected. Instead of wrapping Blossom in comfort or directing their outrage toward Peter, they turned on Blessed. Her father's voice rose first. "So you brought shame to our house and thought the solution was to dump it back here?" Her mother was more restrained but colder. "How could you leave your sister exposed like that? You call yourself a wife." The room erupted in accusations. Why didn't she watch over Blossom better? Why didn't she confront her husband? Why did she bring disgrace upon the family instead of protecting it? Blessed sat through it all, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. And when they were done, she stood up, quietly took her bag, and walked out. Nobody followed her. She returned home to Peter that evening, alone in more ways than one. The house felt colder after Blossom left, though the weather hadn't changed. Blessed moved through the rooms like a ghost, her footsteps quiet, her voice even quieter. Peter pretended nothing was wrong. He kept his routines intact, early devotions, long absences, dramatic sermons on the pulpit. Sometimes he even brought laughter into the house, laughing loudly at his own jokes, or clapping Blessed on the back as if she were a friend, not a wife barely holding herself together. Blessed didn't ask questions anymore. She cooked, cleaned, and ironed his clothes with mechanical precision, but the light had gone from her eyes. The gentle woman who once hummed while folding laundry or prayed aloud while sweeping now moved in silence. Her Bible sat untouched on the nightstand, collecting dust. She no longer went to church services unless it was necessary. Even when she sat in the front row, her eyes didn't follow her husband's gestures. She stared straight ahead, seeing everything, yet nothing. Weeks passed, and Blessed's body began to betray her. Her appetite vanished. Her skin dulled. At night, she'd wake up drenched in sweat, her breathing shallow, her chest tight. Peter barely noticed. When she mentioned feeling tired, he waved it off. "You're stressed," he said. "Rest more." But rest didn't help. One Sunday after church, she collapsed in the hallway while removing her shoes. It was their neighbor who found her, rushed her to the hospital, and sat beside her bed when she woke up. The diagnosis came with soft, slow words from the doctor. Something about complications, delayed stress reactions, and an immune system too weak to fight back. "She needs peace," the doctor said. "Her body is tired, deeply tired." When Peter was informed, he frowned and muttered something about spiritual warfare. He prayed over her that evening, pressing his hand on her head, rebuking demons, and quoting scripture. But when he was done, he left her there, alone, again. Blossom had given birth by then, a quiet delivery in a modest clinic, with only her mother and one aunt by her side. She named the child Emmanuel. The baby was healthy, his cries strong, his eyes wide and searching. But even in her exhaustion, Blossom couldn't bring herself to feel joy. She didn't look at his face for too long. She fed him, bathed him, and rocked him gently, but her eyes were always distant. Back in Lagos, Bless's condition worsened. She stopped getting out of bed. Her bones ached. Her breath shortened. Yet she said nothing. She waited, in silence, for something to shift, perhaps for Peter to finally see her, or for her body to fight its way back to life. But neither happened. One rainy morning, before the sky turned blue, the nurse who checked in on her weekly found her still and cold, her hands folded neatly over her chest, as though she had decided it was time. The house, which had once been filled with sermons and laughter and prayer, now echoed only with emptiness. Her death was announced to the church in the most careful of words: "Our dear mummy in the Lord has gone to be with the Father." But no one said why, and no one said how. The funeral was quiet, almost awkward. People came because they had to, not because they wanted to. The front rows were filled with women from the church's prayer department, all dressed in white lace, fanning themselves slowly in the heat. Pastor Peter sat at the front too, dressed in black, head slightly bowed, hands clasped like a grieving husband. He wept when the microphone was passed to him, quoting scriptures about life, death, and eternal peace. Blessed was a gift, he said, his voice low and trembling, a quiet strength that carried me through my darkest seasons. There were sniffles from the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, but a few others, especially those who knew what wasn't being said, just stared blankly. Blossom wasn't present. She'd stayed back with her baby, unable to face the sight of a coffin that might as well have carried 1,000 unspoken truths. After the service, no one really lingered. There were no clusters of people sharing warm stories or comfort, just brief condolences, polite hugs, and then silence. When Blessed's body was lowered into the ground, Peter stood stiffly beside the grave, his eyes dry now. The moment the final shovelful of sand hit the casket, he turned and walked away before the others. He didn't wait for the prayers to end, didn't speak to the family, didn't even glance at the headstone. He drove home alone that afternoon, his phone already ringing, calls from church members, some asking about arrangements, others reminding him of upcoming programs. Within a week, his routine resumed. He preached the following Sunday, more fiery than before. He told the congregation, "The enemy thought he could shake this ministry, but we stand unbroken." The crowd shouted in agreement. People danced, clapped, some even cried. But something had shifted. A few members, especially the older ones, watched him with quieter eyes now. They noticed things they hadn't before. How often he changed his assistant. How often young women were seen in his office behind closed doors. How too many things that used to feel sacred now felt like performances. It didn't take long for the whispers to return, but this time they weren't whispers. They were testimonies. A young choir member confided in her friend. Another woman broke down during a midweek service and confessed publicly that she had been led into sin by someone she once admired. Each story chipped away at the image Peter had tried to rebuild. The church board tried to manage it at first. Quiet meetings, controlled damage. But the voices grew too loud. A petition was signed. Elders from the headquarters were called in. Within a month of Blessed's burial, Pastor Peter was dismissed from his position, not in a fiery announcement, but in a brief, awkward statement read aloud during the second service. Due to personal matters affecting the integrity of this ministry, Pastor Peter is stepping down indefinitely. He didn't return to the pulpit after that. The man who once commanded crowds with a whisper now lived in a silent house, curtains drawn, phone unanswered. People stopped visiting. Invitations stopped coming. Slowly, surely, the man of God faded from the place he once ruled, and no one missed him. The compound, once known for its vibrancy, began to wither, like a garden left untended. The gates were no longer polished. The paint on the fence had begun to peel, and the once carefully swept driveway was now littered with dry leaves. Pastor Peter, now simply Mr. Peter, remained inside most days. The sounds of morning prayers and worship rehearsals had faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet that echoed through the empty rooms. The silence was loudest in the evenings, when the absence of blessed soft footsteps or the gentle clatter of her cooking filled the air with a heaviness Peter couldn't escape. He stopped dressing in his fine robes. The white agbaras were packed away in suitcases. His once flawless Sunday shoes sat by the door, untouched and slowly gathering dust. The mirror in his bedroom grew streaked from neglect, but he didn't seem to notice. He stopped looking into it. The calls stopped. The text slowed to a trickle and then vanished altogether. Those who used to rush to him for prayers, guidance, or validation now avoided him on the street. Even the church members who once defended him with scripture no longer returned his greetings when their paths crossed at the market or pharmacy. The betrayal had reached too far, touched too many. A few of the women he'd manipulated had left the church entirely, too ashamed or traumatized to return. Others found their voices, sharing what had happened in hushed tones, or to close friends, enough for word to spread. Some came forward to the council. One woman, older, respected, known in the church for her wisdom, was the final straw. When she spoke, her voice did not tremble. She told her story clearly, in full detail, and without bitterness. That testimony cracked open the last layer of doubt for those still clinging to what Peter once represented. No one could defend him now, not without becoming part of the rot. There was no legal case, no police intervention. The women didn't want courtrooms or headlines. They wanted distance, peace. So Peter was left to himself, a man swallowed by the consequences of a lifetime of unchecked power. Occasionally, he would step outside to sit on the porch, staring blankly at the road beyond the compound gates. He no longer recognized many of the children playing across the street. They had grown, while he had shrunk into someone unrecognizable. Sometimes he'd walk to the church he once led, now under the leadership of a younger, stricter pastor who barely acknowledged him. He'd sit in the back row, hoping no one would ask him to leave, but no one ever did. They just didn't speak to him. He was invisible, present but unwanted. The man who once called himself a shepherd was now a stranger in the same pasture he once ruled. And even the wind, when it passed through the compound, seemed to whisper not of anointing or purpose, but of waste. The years didn't pass kindly. Time, once his ally in building a platform of reverence, became his slow punishment. Pastor Peter aged quickly after his fall, not the graceful aging of gray hairs and earned wrinkles, but the quiet kind that makes a man shrink from who he used to be. His face grew sunken, his eyes hollowed by guilt or regret. No one knew for sure. The compound around him grew quieter still. The house developed a permanent smell of dust and wood polish, and the hum of life that once defined it was gone. There were no visitors anymore. Occasionally a neighbor would send food, not out of kindness, but out of pity. He accepted it without looking up. His conversations became whispers to himself, half prayers and half ramblings. He'd sit in the backyard for hours, holding a small, tattered Bible he rarely opened. His fingers traced the leather edges like a ritual, not from devotion, but from memory, muscle memory of a man who once spoke to crowds about righteousness while living in the shadows of deceit. Blossom never came back. Not once. Her child, now growing fast, had no contact with the man who fathered him. Her parents raised the boy quietly, choosing not to speak of the scandal that had once threatened to tear them apart. Blossom herself grew stronger with time. She enrolled in school, worked part-time, and healed in ways no one expected. But she never let her son near that world again. Whenever she passed the church building that had once stood at the center of her undoing, she looked away, not in shame, but in defiance. The place no longer held her captive. It was just bricks and dust now. There were whispers that the church was doing better, that new leadership had restored a sense of order and truth. But for Blossom, it didn't matter. Her healing had come not from any pulpit, but from surviving what had tried to destroy her. And in that survival, she found her own kind of faith, one built from truth, not titles. Peter's final days were quiet, as if even the heavens didn't want to make noise for him. There was no dramatic end, no final confession, no crowd at his bedside. Just an old man in a faded house, lying alone as the fan creaked above him. When he passed, it took days before anyone noticed. It was the neighbor's child who saw the flies near the window and called an adult. His body was taken without ceremony. The church offered a small condolence, a one-line mention in the weekly bulletin. We acknowledge the passing of our former pastor. May God judge all things. No vigil, no tribute, no legacy to preserve. His grave was simple, no marble, no scripture, just a marker with his name and dates. But in the silence that followed, his story remained, a caution, a wound, a truth. And for those who remembered him not as a pastor, but as the man who destroyed too many lives behind a mask of holiness, that was all the legacy he ever earned. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.